The Chinese AI app DeepSeek has caused an overnight upset of the dominance of the US in the field of artificial intelligence. Over the weekend, it became the most downloaded free app on Apple's US App Store, sparking what analysts are calling AI's Sputnik moment. This development caused a significant plunge in Nvidia's stock, with Bloomberg reporting a historical market value drop of nearly $600 billion. But what do these changes mean for AI and national security? At the World Economic Forum in Switzerland, experts analyzed ways to mitigate AI-related national security risks. They highlighted the dangers of unchecked AI-powered autonomous weapons, the exploitation by malicious actors, cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, and the proliferation of disinformation campaigns and deepfakes. Sir Jeremy Fleming, the former director of GCHQ, the UK's intelligence, cyber and security agency, said one of the issues of AI that is affecting security right around the world is how criminals are taking some of the basic tools to perpetuate fraud.
And firstly, the thing that is affecting the security of citizens right around the world is the way in which criminals are taking up some of these basic tools to perpetrate fraud. And I think that the debate around all of that is not nearly developed enough. I don't think the public have understood it enough, and I don't think politicians are on it. So there is a very short-term thing which is around that. Longer term, then, we worrying about the loss of control. We're worrying about the way in which this plays into information and trust spaces, and we're worrying about the way in which it could, in some circumstances, be used to create different ways of causing harm, and particularly in the chem bios sectors.
Ian Bremmer, the founder and president of the political risk group Eurasia, said AI has the potential to undermine civil society and democracy. Bremmer warned of the existential risk of losing humanity.
So stipulating that we all are enthusiastic about AI, but we're talking about risks, look, it's clearly going to make criminals more dangerous. It's going to make tinkerers make more consequential mistakes. And it's going to make, most worrying for me, human beings more like computers. And what I mean by that, I mean, everyone's talking about artificial general intelligence and when we're going to get there.
Right.
I think we're going to get to artificial human intelligence faster than we get to artificial general intelligence, AHI, right? I mean, Larry Summers talks about how, you know, IQ will become less important, EQ will become more important with AI. I agree. But AI is increasingly programming EQ out of the people that use it, right? And the more powerful EQ, the more powerful AI gets, and the more it's downloaded to give us exactly what we want and engage with us as, you know, even better than people, even smarter than people, even more capable and facile at treating us exactly the way we want to, we are losing humanity. That undermines civil society, it undermines democracy. That's, to me, the most existential danger, because the thing I care about the most is persisting as we are, as people.
AI's dual-use nature presents both risks and opportunities. It can be weaponized for sophisticated cyber attacks or used to enhance cybersecurity defenses. Henna Virkkunen, Executive Vice President for Tax, Sovereignty, Security and Democracy at the European Union, discussed how the EU is leveraging AI for more efficient border control. She acknowledged that Europe is lagging behind in AI innovation and investment, and emphasized the need for easier business investments in the region.
From the European Commission side, in where we are investing to AI and when we are combining it with security, is, for example, our external borders, because in the border control, we can work much more effective way if we are using AI to monitor the situation there. And also when we look, for example, our critical infrastructure, we know that it has been very much under attack, and we have also witnessed several sabotages, especially when it comes to undersea cables. So to be able also to better protect our critical infrastructure, we are using also AI, for example, for that. So there's several areas now where we are working in the European Commission when it comes to security. What we have to do in Europe is that we have to close the innovation gap, because we know that we are lagging very much behind now when it comes to innovations and investments in Europe. And there we have to really work in several sectors. So I think the most important thing is that we have to have innovation-friendly regulatory framework. We are very much criticizing that we have too much bureaucracy in Europe, and I think we have to take it very seriously. We have to make it easier for businesses to invest in Europe. We are too fragmented still. There's too much barriers between our member states, and we are also missing private investments and venture capital. We are quite much using public funding when it comes to AI and new technologies, but there we also need a single market, capital markets union. So there's several fields where we have to work, and we are very committed to build up our own capacities now when it comes to technologies, especially when it comes to AI, and also to quantum computing, where we are very strong already, and then of course semiconductors, which is very much precondition to any other critical technology. So we are very committed to that we want to invest more, and we want to be more attractive also for the innovations from all over the world. But we have some strengths also when it comes to these critical technologies. We have very strong researchers here, and also we have very strong startups. And I think we have a lot of potential. But now we have to really make it happen. And as you know, next week we will propose and present our competitiveness compass, and there we will very much also show now the path for next 5 years, what we want to achieve. But of course, competition is very hard now globally with USA and with China when it comes to technologies.
Panelists underscore the dangers of unregulated AI advancements, advocating for government safeguards rather than the reliance on the private sector. These concerns follow President Trump's removal of federal oversight for AI companies in the US, one of his inaugural executive orders. Nick Clegg, outgoing president of global affairs at Meta, addressed the challenges following the removal of AI safety regulations at the social media platform.
I think the world generally, and both in the private and the public sector, looked back at the last decade and a half and decided and thought, I'm talking now like 2 or 3 years ago, hang on a minute, social media and other technologies erupted incredibly quickly, and it took us about a decade and a half to kind of catch up with new laws, new guardrails, new institutions, and so on. And I think there was a general sentiment on actually both sides of the fence, and my job for the last 7 years at Meta has been to try and kind of speak the language on both sides of the fence, that this time governance and issues of public and multilateral governance should proceed in parallel with the technology as much as it can, and not an afterthought about a decade and a half later. So I think that was a very strong impulse. And then that led to things like the Bletchley Park Summit, which was the first summit on AI safety, and that was then succeeded by the Seoul Summit and so on. And then institutions were set up, the UK and the EU and others set up a AI Safety Institute. The EU, as the commissioner can describe better than I had, was already working on an AI law, and then before ChatGPT erupted on the scene, and then suddenly tried to retrofit it as soon as generative AI became a thing, and sort of stuck a whole bunch of amendments in it and the sort of final bits of it. The US then created also, or at least the beginnings of a US AI Safety Institute, where companies like Meta and others, as we develop our models, could go through testing and so on. The Biden administration, I was there along with other tech leaders in the White House, signed this executive order laying all this out. That executive order has now been scrapped last week. I don't know what the status is of the US AI Safety Institute. You might be surprised to hear, even though I'm an outgoing executive of Meta, that it sort of leaves us in a slightly peculiar position as an American company, because we might end up having to jump through the hoops and tests of non-US AI safety institutes if there isn't one in the US, because until last week, our approach was, well, we only work with other safety institutes as a sort of hub and spoke extrapolation of the one that exists in the US. So it's very much up in kind of, in flux now, and as like everything, we will hear from President Trump.
Defending Meta's decision to replace fact-checkers with user moderation, Clegg argued that the crowdsourced approach to misinformation proved effective, as recent elections did not indicate AI's negative impact on democracy.
Last year was the largest set of elections in the democratic era. Billions of people were able to go. It's never happened before in the democratic era. And at this time last year, I was being told constantly, events like this, that the whole year was going to be disfigured. AI was going to hijack democracy. Democracy was going to end. Every election was going to be completely flooded with synthetic content. The most important conclusion of the last year, and I don't want to be complacent, I'm not saying this is a prediction of the future, is how little of that happened. And what you see in companies like Meta is that they actually build systems which go after misinfo and disinfo, however you define that. They go after the content, not the genesis of it. It doesn't matter whether it's produced by a human being or a robot. If it's disinfo or misinfo, the systems, and they are AI, they're machine learning systems, are actually extremely sophisticated at going after the content. And I got super frustrated last year. Everyone freaked out about the fact that you now have AI-generated content. But the systems are built to go after the content itself. And so far, they've been proven to be relatively robust. Doesn't mean, by the way, in the future, we won't have to deal with vast amounts of synthetic slop. We will do, and that's a challenge. I personally think that, broadly speaking, not completely, broadly speaking, that the approach that I saw being promulgated in these multilateral summits, I thought was relatively thoughtful. It was trying to preserve optionality for innovation. It wasn't trying to weigh down everything by trying to second guess or third or fourth guess, downstream risks, which are almost impossible for a generalized technology. They were starting to set up relatively light touch institutions. So I hope, broadly speaking, that multilateral approach will preserve. But I mean, final, and this is Ian's and others' domain. I mean, the interesting thing, why this is so fascinating is this is a classic example of the clash of two forces which will shape our world. It's the globalization of technology and the deglobalization of politics.
Professor Xu Lan, Dean of the Schwarzman College at Tsinghua University in China, seemed unfazed by AI control concerns, describing China's policy as agile in leading AI development. He was, however, concerned about deep fakes.
AI has already developed very fast over the last decade or so. I think China has taken an approach as I would call it an agile governance approach. I think initially in the early years, I think China had a AI development plan, an overall national plan, and then China came out with some so-called governing principles, providing some general guidance of the AI development, and then also pushed out some foundational legislations, such as personal information protections and so on. And then I think China was taking a more of an adaptive approach when there were problems. I mean, first of all, you encourage innovation, but when there were problems coming out, and then have specific regulations to govern those specific domains or application areas. One example is the generative AI, and China actually was the first country came out with a regulation on the generative AI. So I think that's the kind of approach. Of course, China is willing to update of those regulations and also some principles. So I think through that, I think as you can see that the AI has been developed very fast, but also I think in terms of the overall, I think on the security side, I think it's relatively okay.
Professor Xu said both China and the US have contributed greatly to the AI space, and applications like DeepSeek and TikTok have benefited consumers.
I think look at the academic papers and patents. China published more papers than any other country over the last 10 years. Patents the same. So I think that both countries are contributing greatly to this ecosystem, and they work together. Many scholars work together, and so on. So I think in terms of the sort of national competition, I think it's more of the U.S. viewing China as a rivalry and sort of having this chip embargo that indeed hurt China in some way. I don't think that Chinese companies see U.S. as a big competitor, but rather they're really trying to find application domestically, and also, of course, I think when possible, compete globally. And I think that the outcome of that is you see the great benefits to the consumers, like TikTok, right? I mean, we see this, and when TikTok was banned, I see people find red notes. It's another wonderful example. So I think actually there are many ways actually the two countries can work together. But also I think on the security side, I think both U.S. and China recognize the security concerns. So actually I think we know that last year there was a track 1 dialogue, and also there were track 2 dialogue, mostly on the security side. And I think that, of course, I think our colleagues mentioned about the AI Safety Research Institute. So there's indeed a global network of that. And China is also, having its own network of AI safety research institutes in China, and they're trying to be part of that. Unfortunately, I think there are still in some forces in the U.S. that didn't want China to be part of that. So we hope that with the new administration, that will change.
Proposals were put forward on how nation states could collaborate to ensure that AI does not harm nation states. One suggestion mirrored China's Belt and Road Initiative. Ian Bremmer said he believed global alignment between the US, China, and the European Union is possible.
Well, first of all, I mean, when I talk about like building institutions that are stronger, the difference between this and say the other one that's come up recently, which we all talked a lot about, Belt and Road, is that Belt and Road, like, I mean, the Chinese build a port, but anyone can use the port, right? So, I mean, like, you'd like it to be built by the US or by the UK or by Japan, as opposed to by China, given, sort of levels of openness and contracting and the rest. But, I mean, you still want them to have ports. On the other hand, I mean, if AI and what is coming in the box in a tier 1 country is only determined by, sort of the US and a small number of companies, then that is necessarily really problematic to China. And if the only countries that aren't part of that alignment are weaker, poorer countries,
Right.
then, I think you are setting up for big challenges. Now, to be fair, there are places where the Chinese are dominant. And, you look at, the other big, sort of ecosystem of new technologies, which is transition energy, and the Chinese are becoming dominant. In some ways, they already are. And so, like, I could imagine a world where, electrons are moved primarily by China in 20 years, and where, AI is moved primarily by the United States. That's a very interesting kind of world.
Sir Jeremy Fleming cited the nuclear sphere as a precedent for international cooperation on national security threats.
There are lessons from history on how states work together on the highest potential threat areas. And of course, the nuclear example is the one that we most readily move to in this space. And I think there are lessons from that. And so looking at the areas of most potential harm, trying to make sure we have lines of communication and dialogue, looking at international law and checking on its applicability given new forms of technology. So there's a roadmap for there. I think it's imperative that China is in and alongside those sorts of conversations. And that's why the UK took the approach it did at Bletchley last year, inviting China along. So we mustn't lose that. But I want to turn back to two things that have been said previously in this conversation. The first is this point about over-indexing, in your point. And the problem here is that the over-indexing is coming from the private sector, whereas in the past, these sorts of technologies and capabilities with these sorts of ramifications have largely been developed through military public sectors under government control. And so the fact that a company is over-indexing, whether it's Meta or not, or one of the other, plenty other companies you could point to out there, the fact that a company is over-indexing, that is causing us as practitioners more concern because it's the private sector doing it. And the public sector, the national security community, governments are having to find out and work on new ways of getting their arms around that, of new ways of influencing. And this comes back down to a different way of partnering. So I'm no longer there, but if you're sat at the top of a national security agency at the moment, you are looking at capabilities, you are looking at data, you're looking at skills, and in all three of those areas, you're thinking, where do they come from? And they are, a lot of those, the dominance in those is coming from the United States. So as national security communities, whether you're in the UK or elsewhere in the world, then the Rubik's Cube you are trying to solve is how do you get some pieces that fit in with that trajectory of American national security that makes you as relevant as you've been in the past 75 years. Now, from the UK's perspective, we've always been a much smaller player than the United States. But there isn't a day that goes past when what happens in the UK isn't on the desk of the president. And so I think what we've got to do in Europe, what we've got to do in the UK, what we do in other allies of America is work out what is the version of that for an AI and a tech-dominated world that gives collective security, not only to those people who might be the main recipients of it, but to America as well.
Ian Bremmer and several other speakers at the forum expressed concern that the sovereignty of AI lies in the hands of the private sector.
I look at OpenAI, I look at what their mission is, and the mission is to create AGI, and their definition of that is where, sort of a computer or AI can do, tasks better than human beings on the entire range of economically productive activity. Now, there is no problem with that as long as the government is the one that's doing the appropriate regulation. But if the company exerts sovereignty, that's great for like shareholders. It might even be great for consumers if they're not products. It might be great for consumers, depends on what they want to do with it. But it's certainly not great for citizens, right? And governments are the ones that need to be looking out for citizens and determining the range of things that AI does as it becomes so powerful. I can't think of governments out there that would want AI and AGI to be solely or maybe even principally developed for, maximizing economically productive work as defined by OpenAI. That strikes me as enormously problematic because, the last time we did that, we got negative externalities. That's how we got climate change. What do you think the negative externalities are going to be for AI? So I have no problem with the private sector defining this however it wants, as long as the ultimate sovereignty lies in the hands of the government. And right now, we are not remotely close to that being true.
US President Donald Trump said DeepSeek should be a wake-up call for American AI firms. His White House press secretary, Karoline Leavitt, said US officials are looking at the national security implications of DeepSeek, while David Sachs, Trump's crypto czar, accused the Chinese AI company of distilling knowledge from OpenAI's models to develop its app. What has become clear over the past week is that markets had been stunned, security agencies have been rattled, and President Trump's vision of US technological dominance in AI has been upended. The rapid progress of DeepSeek has highlighted the rising threat from foreign AI advancements. This is Linda van Tolberg for National Security News.